You know, these days there is a lot of talk about democracy in danger. Several European countries have taken far-right turns in just the past few years, and China and Russia continue to flex their muscles across the world stage. A new book is out that details it all. It's called Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. I recently sat down with its author, Larry Diamond. Larry, in your book, you argue that the world is at the end or approaching the end of a third wave of democratization and that we could be entering a new era of tyranny. Briefly explain what that means.
Well, what it means is that for the period from the mid-1970s until the early 2000s, and especially since the end of the Cold War, we've had a remarkable period of expansion of democracy, of freedom, of rule of law, of constitutional rights. And since around 2006, we've been in a protracted democratic recession with a gathering tide of breakdowns of democracy in countries like Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, now a European Union country, Hungary, and others, the Philippines, that are kind of hanging by a thread. And this threatens to reverse much of the progress we made in the previous decades.
Let's focus on our nation just for a moment. How much trouble do you think American democracy is in right now? And are those troubles caused by Trump, just exploited by Trump, or is Trump just happening at the same time as other forces that are already straining the democracy here?
They are certainly being caused in part by Donald Trump, but the challenges we face of democracy in the world did not begin with Donald Trump, and they will not end with Donald Trump. They're rooted in deepening trends of political polarization in the United States, of partisanship as a kind of tribalism, and of increasing dysfunction of our political system, beginning with the inability of Congress and in itself and in interaction with the executive branch to get much of anything done. But Trump's vitriol, his contempt for the rules of the democratic game, his toying, at least, if not indulgence, of racist and ethnocentric language and terminology, I think has made it far, far worse.
If you had the power, what fixes would you make to our system to make sure it better protects our democracy?
Well, I think by far the single most dramatic and effective thing we could do to depolarize our politics and make it more functional would be to change the electoral incentives. Right now, politicians, members of Congress, state legislatures, governors, and so on, are selected in low turnout party primaries that are dominated by the more militant wings of the two parties. And then they face off against one another in a general election where the person with the most votes wins, which makes it virtually impossible for any third force or any independent candidate to contest. If we had ranked choice voting at the state level and maybe someday at the national level, as we have in many municipalities in the United States, then people could rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4, not vote for just a single candidate. And if their most preferred candidate were not to finish first, or if they were to finish last in the competition, say for a House seat, that candidate would be eliminated and their vote would be transferred to their next choice in an instant runoff until somebody emerged with a majority of the vote in the district. When that happens, no votes are wasted. And a third candidate, an independent candidate, a libertarian candidate, whatever it might be, doesn't have to worry about being a spoiler. People are able to vote for their true choices. And if nobody gets a majority, you get these instant runoffs until somebody emerges. This, I think, would permit more moderate candidates to challenge the nominees of one or both of the predominant parties if all that the parties are offering is fairly highly ideologically defined candidates.
When you look around the world, Larry, in general, is the bigger threat to democracy some external threat like the rise in migration and immigration or economic strains, environmental changes, things like that? Or is it individuals like Putin and Xi and Trump?
Well, it's the two interacting, and it's very hard to say that it's only one or the other. I do think we need to understand that there are big structural forces at work in terms of globalization, in terms of the acceleration of immigration, in terms of people feeling like they're losing control of their countries, or losing control over their borders, that they have no confidence in their economic security or the economic future for their children. These are very powerful forces that are detaching people from their previous political alignments, leading to cynicism about all of the existing parties and a general trend that kind of is smashing conventions, rules, institutions, and so on. But then I think you can't ignore the independent weight of authoritarian leaders who are making their own regimes, their own countries more deeply authoritarian, and becoming more aggressive at trying to impose those values, those norms, and those interests in a kind of illicit way on our own democracies. And then we have the personality of the president himself, who has willfully and eagerly taken upon himself the role of deliberately and provocatively, more deeply and viciously dividing the American public.
And that brings me nicely to my final question. There seem to be two main tyrannical fears about Donald Trump: that he'll ignore the constraints that our system of government places on our presidents, and the government will be too weakened by sycophants to stop him, or that Trump will lose an election and simply refuse to leave. I'm curious how seriously you take each of those threats, and how much confidence you have in our elected leaders and our system to put nation over party if needed to, and to stop him.
I think the real test is going to be how subtle it is. If it's as subtle as the Trump administration trying to rig the census by imposing on it a question that they know will discourage participation by Hispanics and other minorities, there will not be a rallying around democratic principles on the part of his fellow party members. I think we've already seen that. And if it's just a kind of incremental creep along the line of the violation of norms that he is already engaged in, I don't have confidence. But if he does something as grotesque and shocking as rejecting the clear outcome of a presidential election in which he's lost majority of electoral college votes, I think the Supreme Court is simply not going to stand for that, and neither are the other key pillars of American power that would, in the end, decide. So I think the danger is of a more subtle creep of authoritarian tendencies and norms rather than in the kind of blatant shock that you're describing.
Larry Diamond is a professor at Stanford. He's also the author of Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. Larry, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back with more RFL right after this.